Imagine Christmas Eve in the 1800s, not the kind painted on Victorian postcards filled with glowing windows and overflowing tables, but a quieter, colder night, where a poor family sits close together in a single dim room, listening to the wind press against thin walls, trying to turn an ordinary winter evening into something that feels, even briefly, like Christmas. For poor families of the 19th century, Christmas did not begin with gifts or feasts, but with uncertainty, with the simple question of whether the fire would last through the night, whether the small loaf of bread bought with hard-earned coins would be enough for all the children, and whether the following morning would bring work, or only another long walk through frozen streets in search of it. And it was within this fragile balance between scarcity and hope that Christmas quietly took shape. In the industrial cities of England, America, and much of Europe, working families often lived crowded into a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and workspace, where damp walls held the cold and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke, wet wool, and thin soup simmering slowly in a chipped pot. And on Christmas Eve the room looked much the same as any other winter night, except for a small, deliberate effort to make it feel different, perhaps a cleaner corner swept carefully, or a candle saved for this evening alone. Children with reddened hands and patched sleeves gathered near the hearth, not dreaming of toys wrapped in paper, but watching the fire closely, because the fire meant warmth, and warmth meant sleep, and sleep meant relief from the long, exhausting rhythm of factory hours, street labor, or field work that defined the rest of the year. And even the adults, worn thin by months of physical strain, allowed themselves to slow their movements just slightly, as if acknowledging that this night at least deserved gentleness. Food on Christmas for the poor was rarely abundant, yet it was chosen with care, often stretched and shared in ways that turned simplicity into ritual. A bit of bread saved from earlier in the week, perhaps a small piece of meat if fortune had been kind, or a pudding made from leftovers and sweetened modestly, not for indulgence but to mark the day as different, as meaningful, as something worth remembering when the winter grew harsher in the weeks to come. There was no tree in many of these homes, no ornaments or bright ribbons, but sometimes a sprig of evergreen rested on a shelf or above a door, brought in from the street or nearby fields, carrying the quiet symbolism of life continuing even in the deepest cold. And it was often this small detail, more than anything else, that signaled Christmas had arrived. Voices softened as the night deepened. Stories were told slowly, not grand tales but memories, fragments of childhood, or simple hopes spoken gently, so as not to wake the smallest children already drifting towards sleep. And in that low, flickering light, Christmas for the poor was less about celebration and more about endurance, about holding warmth, family, and dignity together for one night longer. And as the fire settled into glowing embers and the room grew still, the meaning of Christmas in the 1800s quietly revealed itself, not in abundance but in closeness, patience, and the shared understanding that tomorrow would be difficult again, but tonight at least they had each other. As the night moved deeper, and the cold outside pressed more firmly against windows clouded with frost, Christmas morning for poor families in the 1800s did not arrive with excitement or sudden joy, but with a gradual waking, as one by one the children stirred beneath shared blankets, their breath visible in the air, their first instinct not to rush toward gifts, but to check whether the fire still lived, whether the room was warm enough to climb out from beneath the heavy layers of worn clothing that had doubled as bedding. Morning light, pale and winter thin, slipped quietly through small windows, revealing the same room as the night before, yet touched now with a subtle sense of importance, because this was Christmas Day, even if nothing about the furniture, the walls, or the clothes suggested celebration, and parents rose early, not out of habit alone, but because work did not always stop for holidays, especially for the poor, and any pause in wages could mean hunger later in the winter. For children, Christmas morning was shaped more by anticipation than fulfillment, by stories they had heard rather than experiences they expected, and if a gift existed at all, it was often something handmade, a wooden figure carved slowly in spare moments, a rag doll stitched together from scraps of fabric, or an apple saved carefully for weeks, its skin slightly wrinkled but treasured all the same. And these small offerings were received not with disappointment, but with a seriousness that reflected how rare such moments were. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was simple and familiar. Bread softened near the fire, perhaps sweetened slightly if there was a bit of sugar left, or porridge warmed slowly, while the family sat close together, speaking softly, conserving energy, and allowing the day to unfold at its own restrained pace. Because Christmas for the poor was not a break from hardship, but a pause within it, a quiet breath taken before the long stretch of winter resumed. In some neighborhoods, the sound of distant church bells reached even the poorest streets, carried faintly through the cold air, and while many families could not afford time away from work, the sound alone was enough to remind them that this day held meaning beyond survival, that it connected them to others, rich and poor alike, all marking the same moment in the year, even if in vastly different ways. Outside, the streets were quieter than usual. Factories slowed or closed briefly, and those who did venture out moved carefully, bundled against the cold, passing shop windows filled with displays meant for others, their reflections visible in the glass, faces tired but calm, accustomed to wanting without expecting. And children learned early how to read these moments, how to carry hope without letting it become painful. In the afternoon, if work allowed, families remained indoors, conserving fuel, keeping the fire small but steady, and conversation drifted slowly, sometimes turning to memories of better years, sometimes to plans for the coming months, spoken not with optimism but with resilience, because survival itself had become a skill passed quietly from one generation to the next. And as Christmas Day stretched onward, unremarkable yet deeply felt, the poor of the 1800s experienced the holiday not as a spectacle, but as a thread of meaning woven gently into an otherwise harsh season, subtle enough not to draw attention, yet strong enough to hold them together when winter still had many weeks left to give. As Christmas Day slowly gave way to evening, the light fading early as it always did in winter, poor families in the 1800s settled once more into the familiar rhythm of conserving warmth and energy, aware that this quiet holiday pause was already slipping away, and that tomorrow would likely demand the same endurance as every other day before it. Children grew sleepy early, their excitement gentle and brief, and they were guided back beneath layered coats and blankets laid out on the floor, or narrow beds pushed close together, while adults tended the fire carefully, deciding how much fuel could be spared through the night, knowing that coal or wood wasted now might be missed deeply before winter loosened its grip. And in these small decisions, the weight of responsibility never truly rested, not even on Christmas. Conversation softened again as darkness settled in, voices lowered instinctively, not out of reverence alone but from habit, because quiet helped preserve warmth, and warmth preserved strength, and stories returned once more, simple recollections of past winters, of relatives long gone, of moments when life had briefly felt lighter, and these memories were not told to escape reality, but to anchor it, to remind everyone in the room that hardship had been endured before and could be endured again. In some homes, a Bible or prayer book rested on a shelf, and a few verses might be read aloud slowly, not ceremoniously, but thoughtfully, offering comfort rather than instruction, and even in households less bound to religion, the idea of Christmas as a night of reflection lingered, shaping the mood into something quieter, more inward, as if the season itself encouraged restraint rather than celebration. Outside, snow sometimes fell unnoticed, settling silently on streets and rooftops, muffling sound and movement, and when someone stepped outside briefly, perhaps to check on a neighbor or return borrowed fuel, the cold felt sharper, the darkness deeper, making the modest warmth inside seem suddenly precious, even if it was far from comfortable. The contrast between homes like these and the brightly lit houses of the wealthy existed just beyond reach, visible in distant windows or spoken of quietly, but for the poor, comparison rarely led to resentment on Christmas night, because energy was too valuable to spend on bitterness, and instead it was invested in keeping children fed, fires burning, and spirits steady enough to last until spring. As the hours passed and the room settled into stillness once more, Christmas in the 1800s revealed itself not as a moment of abundance, but as an exercise in endurance softened by tenderness, a night where love expressed itself not through excess, but through shared warmth, careful planning, and the quiet promise that no one in the room would be left to face the cold alone. And while the world beyond these walls continued unchanged, factories waiting, fields frozen, wages uncertain, the simple act of surviving Christmas together became its own form of meaning, one that lingered gently in memory long after the embers cooled, and the holiday slipped back into the long stretch of winter days ahead. When the night finally thinned and Christmas passed almost unnoticed into the following morning, poor families in the 1800s woke not to celebration, but to continuity, to the familiar understanding that the world did not pause for long, even for holy days, and that the warmth, food, and rest borrowed from Christmas would now need to be carefully repaid through effort and endurance. The day after Christmas often arrived with a sharper sense of reality. As factories reopened, workshops stirred back to life, and fields remained frozen and unyielding. And for many children, especially in urban neighborhoods, this meant returning to work alongside adults, their small hands already accustomed to labor, their memories of Christmas already softening into something distant and faint, like a dream that lingered briefly before dissolving into routine. Parents moved with quiet efficiency, folding away the small signs of celebration, the candle stub saved from Christmas Eve, the evergreen sprig now drying and brittle, not out of sadness, but practicality, because space was limited and order mattered, and even these small acts of tidying carried a certain tenderness, as if preserving the memory required careful handling. Meals returned to their usual simplicity, often thinner than those of Christmas Day, as ingredients saved for the holiday were now gone, and hunger, never fully absent, reasserted itself gently but persistently, shaping each decision, each portion, each glance into the cupboard. Yet this return to scarcity did not erase what Christmas had been, because its meaning had never depended on abundance in the first place. In the weeks that followed, winter deepened, nights grew longer still, and Christmas became a reference point rather than a destination, something remembered quietly during cold evenings when children huddled close to the fire and adults calculated how much fuel remained. And it was during these moments, long after the holiday itself, that the true role of Christmas in poor households revealed itself most clearly. It was not a single day of joy, but a reminder, subtle and steady, that hardship could be softened by closeness, that even the smallest ritual could lend structure to an otherwise relentless season, and that survival was not only physical but emotional, dependent on shared moments of calm, however brief. Neighbors continued to help one another in small ways, borrowing coal, sharing news of work, watching children while someone searched for employment, and these quiet exchanges, more than any feast or decoration, formed the backbone of winter life for the poor, extending the spirit of Christmas far beyond the calendar itself. And so, as the year edged forward and the promise of spring remained distant, the memory of Christmas lingered not as a moment of escape, but as a quiet reassurance, woven gently into the rhythm of daily life, reminding those who endured the cold that even in the harshest seasons, warmth could still be created, slowly, deliberately, and together. As winter settled fully into its longest stretch, Christmas faded further into memory for poor families of the 1800s, yet it never disappeared entirely because its meaning had quietly folded itself into everyday survival, into the way people moved more carefully through cold rooms, shared what little warmth they had, and spoke gently in the evenings when exhaustion pressed heavily on their shoulders. In many homes, the weeks after Christmas were the hardest, because small savings were gone, fuel supplies thinned, and wages were uncertain. And it was during these long, dark evenings that the habits learned on Christmas night proved their value. the careful tending of embers, the shared blankets, the unspoken agreement to stay close, to waste nothing, and to endure together rather than alone. Children, already familiar with responsibility, adapted quickly, rising early, helping carry water, minding younger siblings, or returning to factories and workshops, where the sound of machinery replaced the quiet crackle of the hearth. And yet, even there, traces of Christmas lingered in the form of a saved apple, eaten slowly over several days, or a small handmade toy tucked carefully into a pocket, brought out only at night, as if to protect its fragile magic from the harshness of daylight. Adults carried Christmas differently, not as anticipation, but as resolve, a quiet reminder that they had already survived one of the coldest points of the year, and could therefore survive what followed. And this mindset shaped the way they approached each new day, steady, practical, and rarely dramatic, because drama required energy they could not afford. Occasionally, charity reached these households, though it was unpredictable and often limited. A loaf of bread from a church collection, a small parcel from a local benefactor, or leftover food distributed after grander celebrations elsewhere. And while these gifts were received with gratitude, they were never relied upon, because poor families understood deeply that survival depended first on themselves and on one another. Evenings remained the most important time of day, when work ended and the cold seemed to grow louder, and families gathered again in the same tight spaces where Christmas had been observed, repeating the same routines, the same slow meals, the same quiet conversations, and in doing so, unknowingly preserving a rhythm that had sustained generations before them. Stories continued to be told, not always about Christmas, but about perseverance, about parents and grandparents who had endured even harsher winters, about moments when help arrived unexpectedly, or when ingenuity made the difference between comfort and hunger. And these stories served a purpose beyond entertainment, teaching children how to endure without bitterness, how to find meaning without excess. And as the long winter nights stretched on, each one blending gently into the next, Christmas remained less a memory of joy and more a soft reference point, a reminder that even in the poorest homes, there had been one night when effort slowed, voices softened, and survival itself had been honored, not loudly, but quietly, patiently, and together. As the weeks of winter continued to pass, poor families in the 1800s learned to measure time not by holidays, but by weather, by how often the fire needed tending, by how quickly bread disappeared from the table, and by how tired everyone felt when evening finally arrived. Yet even in this practical way of living, Christmas remained present, not as a date, but as a feeling that returned whenever the family gathered closely and allowed themselves a moment of stillness. Snowstorms came and went, sometimes trapping families indoors for days, and during these moments the small rooms that had held Christmas night once again became the center of life, filled with the quiet sounds of breathing, the soft scrape of a spoon against a bowl, and the occasional murmur of reassurance spoken more for comfort than necessity. And it was in these enclosed spaces that children absorbed lessons that would shape them for life. Lessons about patience, cooperation, and the quiet dignity of enduring hardship without complaint. Clothing was worn thin by this point in the season, sleeves patched repeatedly, shoes stiff with cold, and yet special care was taken with what little remained. Coats shared among siblings, scarves passed from one person to another, because the memory of Christmas had reinforced the importance of fairness, of making sure no one was left colder than the rest, even when resources were scarce. In some households, a song remembered from church or childhood surfaced again during these evenings, hummed softly rather than sung aloud, not to disturb neighbors or waste breath. And these melodies, slow and familiar, carried echoes of Christmas without needing words, wrapping the room in a sense of continuity that stretched backward through generations who had lived much the same way. For parents, these quiet nights offered rare moments of reflection, as they watched their children sleep and considered how quickly another year would pass, how soon the next winter would come, and how each Christmas marked not abundance but survival, a sign that the family had endured yet another turning of the seasons together. Outside, wealthier households moved on to new entertainments, new gatherings, new distractions, but within poor homes the rhythm remained steady and unchanged. And rather than feeling excluded, many families found a strange comfort in this consistency, because predictability meant safety, and safety, even without comfort, was deeply valued. Gradually, almost without notice, the days lengthened, light returning a few minutes at a time, and though spring was still distant, the worst of winter no longer felt endless, and Christmas, once far behind them, began to seem less like a single night, and more like a quiet marker on the long road they had already travelled. And so life continued, shaped by labour, weather, and shared endurance, with Christmas living on not in decorations or gifts, but in habits of care, closeness, and restraint, passed quietly from one winter evening to the next, never announced, never celebrated loudly, but never truly forgotten, as winter slowly loosened its grip. Though never all at once, poor families in the 1800s sensed the change not through calendars or celebrations, but through small, almost imperceptible signs: a slightly warmer morning, a longer patch of light on the floor, a fire that seemed to last a little longer before needing more fuel. And in these moments, Christmas returned quietly to their thoughts, not as an event, but as a memory of having already endured the hardest part. Children noticed the change first, their movements growing lighter, their voices a little brighter in the evenings, even as work and responsibility remained, and sometimes, without being prompted, they brought out the small objects they had received at Christmas: the carved figure, the stitched doll, the saved ribbon, not to play loudly but simply to hold, as if touching them helped connect the present moment to a night when the world had felt briefly gentler. Adults too felt the subtle shift, though they rarely spoke of it, their relief expressed instead through quieter sighs, steadier hands, and a willingness to imagine the coming months with slightly less caution. And it was during these times that Christmas revealed its lasting purpose, not as a reward but as reassurance, proof that even in the depth of winter there had been warmth enough to carry them through. Meals slowly changed as well, still simple, still modest, but no longer as tightly rationed, and families gathered at the table or around the hearth, in the same close formation that had defined Christmas night, because proximity had become habit, and habit had become comfort, something carried forward long after the reason for it had passed. Stories about Christmas were told again, this time with a hint of distance, not as longing, but as shared memory, parents reminding children how they had all stayed close, how the fire had held, how everyone had made it through, and these retellings served a quiet purpose, teaching children that survival was not only something to be achieved, but something to be remembered and honored. In the wider world, newspapers spoke of progress, of industry, of prosperity returning, but within these small homes time moved according to a different measure, one shaped by seasons rather than promises. And Christmas remained one of the few moments where time had slowed enough to be felt, where effort paused just long enough to allow meaning to settle in. And so, as the year turned and life continued forward, Christmas for the poor in the 1800s lived on in gestures rather than decorations, in the way families instinctively gathered when the air grew cold again, in the care taken to save a candle, a bit of sweetness, a moment of rest, not for luxury, but for necessity, knowing that when winter returned, as it always did, these small acts would once again become the quiet heart of survival. As years passed and winters returned one after another, the memory of those quiet Christmases in poor households of the 1800s settled deeper into family life, becoming less a specific recollection and more a shared understanding, something felt rather than spoken, shaping how people approached cold, scarcity, and one another long after childhood had faded. Children who had once slept fully clothed near dying embers grew into adults who instinctively saved a little extra food when winter approached, who lowered their voices in the evenings, who gathered their own families close when the days grew short, repeating patterns they barely remembered learning, yet carried within them all the same, because those early Christmases had taught them that survival was strongest when it was shared. In later years, when life allowed for slightly more comfort, perhaps a larger room, a steadier wage, or a table that no longer felt quite so empty, these adults often felt a quiet pull toward restraint, choosing simplicity even when abundance was possible, lighting fewer candles, cooking familiar dishes, allowing Christmas to remain calm rather than grand, because excess felt unnecessary, even uncomfortable, compared to the quiet power of closeness they remembered from childhood. Older generations watched this repetition with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in their children's habits the same care, patience, and thoughtfulness that had once defined their own lives. And in this way, Christmas continued to fulfill its quiet role, not as a moment of spectacle, but as a thread connecting past hardship to present stability, reminding families where they had come from and what had carried them through. Even as cities expanded, industries changed, and traditions evolved, the essence of those poor Christmases endured, hidden beneath newer customs, resurfacing whenever people chose warmth over display, togetherness over excess, or rest over relentless effort. And though the world grew louder and faster, this older rhythm never fully disappeared. On winter nights, long after the 1800s had passed into history, families still gathered around small sources of warmth, fires, lamps, or later electric lights, and without knowing why, they spoke more softly, lingered longer, and allowed themselves a pause, reenacting the same quiet rituals once born from necessity, now transformed into choice. And so the story of Christmas for the poor did not end with poverty itself, but flowed onward through memory, habit, and instinct, carried gently from one generation to the next, never announcing itself, never demanding attention, simply remaining present, steady and calm, like a low fire kept alive through the longest nights of winter. As time continued its quiet passage, the memory of those humble Christmases lived on in ways that were almost invisible, shaping instincts rather than traditions, influencing how people responded to cold evenings, shared meals, and moments of rest long after the original hardship had faded into history. For many who had grown up poor in the 1800s, Christmas was never remembered as a day of excitement, but as a feeling of pause, a rare moment when effort eased and the world seemed willing, just briefly, to slow down. And it was this sensation they carried with them, recreating it unconsciously whenever winter returned, whenever life demanded endurance rather than celebration. In their homes, Christmas evenings remained quiet by choice rather than necessity. Lights kept low, conversations unhurried, food prepared simply but with care. And even when children asked for more, these adults often guided them gently toward gratitude rather than excess, not out of strictness, but because they understood how fragile comfort could be and how easily it could be lost. Stories of old Christmases were told without drama, often without dates or names, woven casually into conversations about weather, work, or family. And these stories carried lessons far deeper than nostalgia, teaching younger generations that warmth was something built deliberately, through patience, sharing, and presence, not something guaranteed by circumstance. Outside, the modern world continued to reshape Christmas into something louder and brighter. But within many homes, especially during long winter nights, echoes of the past remained, guiding hands as fires were tended, meals stretched, and children tucked in close, preserving a rhythm that had once been essential to survival. And even when abundance finally arrived, when winters were no longer feared in the same way, this older understanding remained quietly influential, reminding people that the truest comfort of Christmas was never found in what could be bought or displayed, but in what could be shared slowly, quietly, and together. So the story moved on, not toward an ending, but into continuation, carried forward each year as winter returned, each time inviting people, knowingly or not, to rediscover the calm endurance, gentle closeness, and quiet meaning that had once defined Christmas for the poor in the 1800s, and that still lingered patiently beneath the surface of the season. As the years layered themselves one upon another, Christmas remained a quiet anchor in the lives shaped by 19th century poverty, not because it promised change, but because it offered familiarity, a predictable softness in a world that was otherwise uncertain. And this familiarity became something people leaned on without even realizing it. In homes where comfort had once been scarce, the approach of Christmas still brought subtle changes, movements slowing slightly, voices lowering as evenings grew longer, meals prepared with a touch more care even when ingredients were few. And these habits were never announced as tradition, but practiced instinctively, passed down not through instruction but through observation and repetition. Children who had never known abundance learned to read the season differently, sensing Christmas in the way adults lingered a moment longer by the fire, in the way a small treat was divided carefully, so everyone received the same, and in the way tired hands rested briefly, instead of working on without pause. And these signals taught them that the holiday was not about receiving more, but about needing less, at least for one night. For the elderly, Christmas became a time of quiet remembrance, not marked by sadness, but by reflection, as they recalled winters survived, rooms once crowded with children now grown, and nights when the cold had felt sharper than it ever would again. And these memories were held gently, not shared often, but treasured privately, like embers kept alive beneath ash. Outside these homes, the world continued to transform Christmas into spectacle, into brightness and noise. Yet within many families descended from those poorer households, restraint remained part of the season, an unspoken preference for calm over excitement, for closeness over display, because somewhere deep within memory lived the knowledge that Christmas had once been about endurance rather than escape. And so, each year, as winter returned and the days shortened once more, people found themselves recreating, almost unconsciously, the same quiet conditions that had once defined survival, gathering close, conserving warmth, sharing what they had, and allowing themselves a brief pause from the constant demands of life. In this way, Christmas for the poor in the 1800s never truly ended, but continued to unfold slowly across generations, woven into habits, instincts, and moments of stillness, remaining present, not as history, but as atmosphere, a calm, steady presence that asked for nothing more than patience, care, and the simple act of being together. Over time, those quiet Christmases of the 1800s became less about the season itself, and more about a way of moving through the world, a calm discipline learned early and carried forward, shaping how people faced uncertainty, scarcity, and long winters long after the original hardship had passed. In households shaped by poverty, patience became the most valuable inheritance, passed down through example rather than words, seen in the way meals were eaten slowly, in the way warmth was shared without being counted, and in the way Christmas never demanded excitement, only presence, a gentle agreement to pause together before returning to the steady effort of survival. Even as circumstances improved for some, the old instincts remained, candles lit sparingly, gatherings kept intimate, celebrations grounded rather than extravagant, because those who had known cold and hunger understood how quickly comfort could vanish and how fragile abundance truly was when measured against memory. Children raised in these homes absorbed the meaning of Christmas, not through gifts but through atmosphere, through the softness of voices, the closeness of bodies gathered against the cold, and the unspoken understanding that this night mattered precisely because it asked for nothing extra. And these children grew into adults who carried the same quiet expectations into their own families. As generations passed, fewer people remembered the exact conditions of 19th century poverty, yet the emotional shape of those Christmases endured, resurfacing whenever people felt the instinct to slow down, to dim the lights, to sit closer, and to let the outside world wait just a little longer. In this way, the poorest Christmases left one of the deepest marks, teaching that meaning did not require abundance, that warmth could be created deliberately, and that even the harshest seasons allowed room for gentleness, if only for a single evening held carefully between yesterday and tomorrow. And so the story continues, not toward resolution, but toward repetition, carried forward each winter as the days shorten and the cold returns, inviting each new generation, knowingly or not, to rediscover the quiet endurance, shared warmth, and calm closeness that once defined Christmas for the poor, and that still lingers softly at the heart of the season. As winter nights returned year after year, the quiet habits born in poverty continued to shape how Christmas was felt rather than how it was displayed, and even those who no longer struggled as their parents once had still sensed a pull towards simplicity when the season arrived, as if memory itself whispered reminders to slow down. In many homes, Christmas evenings were marked by a deliberate gentleness, movements unhurried, conversations allowed to wander, work set aside just a little earlier than usual. And though the reasons for this restraint were no longer fully remembered, the instinct remained, inherited from nights when exhaustion and cold had made stillness a form of protection. People found comfort in small, repeated actions, a familiar meal prepared the same way each year, chairs drawn closer together, lights kept soft, and these choices created a sense of continuity that linked present warmth to past survival, even if no one spoke of it directly. Those who had once known hunger remembered how food tasted different on Christmas, not because there was more of it, but because it was shared with intention, eaten slowly, appreciated fully, and this awareness lingered, shaping attitudes toward abundance, encouraging moderation and gratitude rather than excess. As generations passed, the world grew louder around the season. Yet within many families, especially on winter nights, there remained a quiet resistance to spectacle, a preference for closeness over display, for warmth over brightness, and this preference traced its roots back to a time when Christmas had been less about celebration and more about endurance softened by care. Children sensed this atmosphere even without explanation, learning that Christmas was a time to be gentle, to listen, to stay close, and these lessons settled deeply, resurfacing later in life when they created their own homes, repeating patterns they could not name, but felt compelled to preserve. And so, without ceremony or conclusion, the legacy of Christmas for the poor in the 1800s continued onward, not as history remembered, but as feeling carried, a quiet presence that returned each winter, asking nothing more than patience, shared warmth, and the simple act of being together while the cold waited outside. By the time those who had once known the true weight of 19th century poverty grew old, Christmas had become something quieter still, a private reflection rather than an event. They would sit by the fire, smaller now but steady, and watch the slow dance of the flame, remembering without words the long corridors of winters past, the years when every ember had been precious. For them, the holiday was not an anniversary of joy, but of endurance, a reminder that life, though hard, had continued. The younger generations who came to visit did not fully understand that silence, but they felt it. They noticed how the old ones lingered in doorways, how they paused before extinguishing the last candle, how they folded each cloth and put away each dish with deliberate care, as if every small act contained a kind of gratitude. Without lectures or stories, these gestures taught that celebration did not need noise, it only needed attention. Outside, the modern world pulsed with light and music, but inside these aging homes the pace remained slow. The smell of coal or wood smoke clung gently to the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of bread baked earlier in the day. A clock ticked softly, someone hummed a half-forgotten tune, and through those simple sounds the memory of long-ago Christmases returned, not as sadness but as peace. What had once been a struggle for warmth had turned into a ritual of mindfulness. Every match struck to light the hearth recalled 100 winters survived. Every shared meal, however small, felt like a victory over the cold that had never quite gone away. In this way, the poor of the 1800s had passed down something stronger than wealth, a sense of calm built from hardship, a deep respect for simplicity, and the knowledge that quiet togetherness could outlast almost anything. As snow fell again outside, soft and steady, covering the streets where factories once roared and carriages once rolled, that old rhythm of Christmas still echoed faintly in the hearts of those who had inherited it, an unspoken understanding that the season's truest gift was time itself, slow, gentle, shared, and fleeting. As generations continued to pass, the echo of those quiet 1800s Christmases still shaped how families met the winter. The memory had thinned, worn smooth by time, yet it endured in gestures so small that no one thought to name them. A door closed softly to keep the warmth in, a fire tended even when it no longer seemed necessary, a whispered goodnight spoken with care rather than habit. The world outside had changed completely. Electric lights now filled the streets, where once there had been only oil lamps and fog. Shop windows glittered with decorations that the poor of another century could never have imagined. Yet somewhere, in modest homes on quiet streets, the old rhythm persisted. People still turned inward when the cold deepened, still chose candlelight over brightness, still drew close to one another as the year came to its end. On Christmas Eve, the air would sometimes carry the faint smell of bread or apples warming in an oven, and families would gather without thinking of ceremony, sitting close, speaking softly, letting the hours slip by. Children, growing sleepy, might not know why this night felt different from others, but they felt the calm settle over the room, the same calm that had once protected families through hunger and frost. It was a legacy that required nothing but gentleness. The poor of the 1800s had built it out of endurance, turning necessity into grace, and though centuries passed, that grace remained, an invisible inheritance stronger than any wealth. And so, every winter, when the world outside grew bright and hurried, some quiet part of the human heart still remembered the way Christmas was once kept, not with abundance, but with stillness, not with noise, but with presence, not with luxury, but with love that asked for nothing more than to last through the night. Now and then, when the wind rises against the glass, and the night folds itself tightly around the house, it is possible to feel the older world pressing faintly at the edges of the present. The sound of a coal shovel, the creak of a wooden stair, the hush of people drawing near a small fire. It is not memory exactly, but something gentler, an inheritance of atmosphere passed down from those who once lived on almost nothing, yet managed to find meaning in what little they had. In that half-silence when modern life grows quiet for just a moment, the essence of those 19th century Christmases returns. It arrives in the scent of smoke, in the way light trembles on a window pane, in the way hands instinctively reach for one another without thinking. It reminds us that the holiday's oldest truth was never about bounty but about endurance softened by tenderness, about surviving the dark together rather than alone. Somewhere, a family sits around a fire, perhaps electric now, its warmth artificial yet comforting all the same, and without realizing it, they are echoing every generation before them. They speak softly, share food, listen to the hum of the house, and for a while, time feels weightless. The past breathes through the present, turning the ordinary into something sacred in its simplicity. The story of Christmas for the poor was never meant to end. It lingers in each act of patience, in every choice to sit quietly instead of rushing, in every gesture of care offered without show. It lives wherever kindness is chosen over comfort, wherever a little light is protected against the vast dark beyond the walls. And so, while snow continues to fall somewhere far away, and the year moves toward its quiet close, the same soft truth endures that warmth made by human hands is enough, that silence can be a kind of prayer, and that even now, centuries later, the calm heartbeat of those forgotten Christmas nights still echoes faintly beneath the sound of the modern world. There are moments, even now, when the air of December seems to hold a weight that cannot be explained by weather alone. It is a feeling that arrives quietly, perhaps while one is walking home through the cold, or standing by a window as frost blooms across the glass. And in that stillness, something ancient stirs, something older than lights or songs or gifts. It is the echo of all those modest Christmases from centuries ago when survival itself was the celebration. In that echo lives a lesson that comfort does not have to be grand to be real. The poor of the 1800s learned this by necessity, and their descendants feel it now by instinct. They know that a dimly lit room can hold more peace than the brightest feast, that a single loaf of bread shared kindly can taste as rich as any banquet, and that the soft murmur of voices in the dark is the sound of safety, the same sound that once carried families through the longest nights of their lives. As the centuries changed and progress swept away the soot and the hunger, something of that simplicity remained tucked within the human heart. It surfaces each year when the noise of the world grows too loud, when people turn down the lights, set aside their distractions and let silence return. For a little while they rediscover what those forgotten families once knew, that warmth made together is stronger than any cold, and that peace comes not from what is given but from what is shared. Perhaps that is why, even in the most modern homes, people still light small flames in the darkness, candles on tables, fires behind glass, strings of light at windows, as if repeating a promise whispered through generations: we are here, we are together, and we will endure. And so, though the centuries have changed the world beyond recognition, the heart of Christmas remains unchanged. It is not a single night, but a way of seeing, the quiet certainty that love and patience can turn even poverty into grace. And as long as someone somewhere pauses to feel that truth, the story continues, soft as snow, endless as winter itself. There is a certain silence that belongs only to winter, a hush that settles over the world when the snow has fallen thick enough to muffle every sound except the faint crack of a hearth and the breathing of those gathered nearby. It is in that kind of stillness that the ghosts of old Christmases seem to live, not as shadows or spirits, but as the soft memory of endurance, the feeling that human warmth has always been enough to face the cold, even when the world beyond the window was merciless. In the 1800s, when so many families lived one small fire away from hunger, Christmas was not a pause from hardship, but a quiet rebellion against it. It was a decision made deliberately and tenderly to find beauty where none should exist, in the flicker of lamplight, in the scent of baking bread that used the last of the flour, in the closeness of people who had nothing left to give except their presence. And though the centuries have shifted everything else, that rebellion still hums softly beneath the modern world, waiting for anyone patient enough to listen. If you look closely, you can still find its traces. It lingers in the way families lean toward one another when the lights are dimmed, in the way hands reach out automatically to adjust a blanket, in the way even the busiest city falls quiet for a single night each year. For a moment, everyone becomes a little poorer, a little humbler, reminded that warmth does not come from comfort alone, but from attention, from the deliberate act of care. In the narrow rooms of the 19th century, that care was everything. The poor had no luxury of distraction. They lived with their hunger, their fatigue, their cold. Yet on Christmas night, something in the air changed. Not the temperature, but the mood. Mothers softened their voices. Fathers came home earlier, and children, though hungry, were allowed to laugh. The meal might be thin, the fire small, but the way people looked at one another shifted. Hardship became lighter when it was acknowledged together. And that, more than anything, was Christmas. A collective breath, a temporary peace within the long battle of survival. When spring returned, those families did not forget what the holiday had meant. It stayed with them as quiet strength. The act of making do became almost sacred, stretching bread, repairing clothes, tending fires with precision, sharing food with neighbors. All of it carried the same discipline that Christmas had taught them, that even the smallest kindness has weight. To waste nothing, to appreciate everything, to remember that endurance itself was holy. And over generations, as poverty lessened and the world industrialized and brightened, that quiet discipline survived. The grandchildren of those poor families grew up with slightly more warmth, slightly fuller plates, but they kept their grandparents' habits. They cleaned before Christmas, even when there was nothing new to display. They baked something simple, something that filled the house with a familiar smell. They taught their children to be polite on Christmas Day, to sit still for a while, to listen, to reflect. They did not know that these were the same lessons the 19th century had taught. They only knew that Christmas was meant to feel different from every other day, slower, softer, more deliberate. By the 20th century, Christmas had changed completely for the world outside. Electricity brought light, commerce brought abundance, and cities glowed with colour. But in the quiet corners of homes, something old still remained. The habit of slowing down, the way people sat close together when the cold came, the sense that warmth should be shared. These instincts were older than the decorations, older than the gifts. They were the inheritance of every family that had once faced the dark without knowing if spring would come. And even now, long after that age has passed, there are nights when modern life falls away for a moment, and that old stillness returns. You can feel it when the power goes out, or when the streets fall silent under fresh snow. You can feel it when you wake at midnight on Christmas Eve and realize that the world outside is utterly still. The hum of machines quiets, the air thickens, and time itself seems to stretch, patient and slow. It is the same silence that once wrapped around the poor of the 1800s, a silence filled not with fear, but with endurance, with presence, with a strange, unspoken faith that dawn will come again. There is something eternal in that faith. It is what kept fires burning in rooms with broken windows, what made mothers sing to sleeping children even when their hands were cracked and raw, what made fathers rise before daylight to find work in the snow. It was not optimism. Exactly. It was devotion to life, to family, to the fragile beauty of simply surviving together. And though time has changed the world beyond recognition, that devotion remains. It has been woven into the very shape of winter, into the rhythm of the year itself. When you think of it that way, Christmas has never truly been about abundance. It has been about recognition, the pause in which we look around and see that we are still here, still together, still capable of kindness despite everything. It is a ritual of survival, masked by ritual joy. It is the candle that burns long after the feast has ended, long after the songs have faded, because someone remembered to tend it carefully, the way their ancestors once did, crouched beside a hearth in the dark. And that candle still burns in every quiet room, in every act of patience, in every word spoken gently instead of sharply, in every small mercy exchanged between strangers. It burns in the simple act of sitting together in silence, listening to the wind outside, remembering that countless winters have come and gone, and that every one of them has ended the same way, with light returning, with warmth returning, with life continuing. So perhaps the poor of the 1800s, though they never knew it, were the ones who defined Christmas forever. Their holiday was not built on plenty, but on persistence, not on wealth, but on wonder, at the smallest things: a loaf of bread, a shared blanket, the sound of a clock ticking through the night, the knowledge that the world, though cruel, could still be kind in moments. And those moments became the foundation of every Christmas that followed. Now, centuries later, when people across the world hang lights and decorate trees and exchange gifts, the true spirit of the holiday still lies somewhere beneath all that brightness. It lies in the hush between words, in the flicker of candlelight, in the way someone covers another with a blanket before going to sleep. It lives in the unspoken understanding that life is fragile and beautiful, that love is both rare and common, and that no matter how much changes, the human need for warmth, physical, emotional, spiritual, never fades. The poor of the 19th century gave us that understanding. They kept it alive through hunger, through cold, through exhaustion, and because of them, the rest of the world learned, even if only subconsciously, how to slow down when the snow falls, how to listen when the night grows long, how to find peace not in plenty but in presence. And so, every winter the story begins again. The snow falls, the lights dim, people gather, the fire burns low, the air grows heavy with silence, and somewhere, Deep in that stillness, the same thought rises, as ancient as the first cold night ever faced by humankind. We are here, we are together, and that is enough. The story does not end here. It never does. It moves forward quietly, generation after generation, through all who pause to listen, through all who choose gentleness when the world demands noise. It lives in the spaces between heartbeats, in the distance between flickering candles, in the moment before sleep, when you realize that even in darkness, warmth still exists, faint but steady, fragile but eternal. Every year, as winter returns and the nights lengthen, the same hush begins to fall over the world. It's a soundless reminder that once, long ago, this season meant danger more than beauty, that for the poor the cold was a test. Yet even then they learned how to make light out of almost nothing. And if you stand very still, somewhere quiet where snow lies thick on the ground, you can still feel it, that ancient hush of survival, that soft pulse of care echoing through time. In the 1800s, families lived by the rhythm of the weather, not the calendar. Christmas didn't sparkle with tinsel or echo with songs from far-off radios. It came as an interruption to struggle, a pause to draw breath, and remember that endurance itself was an act of faith. In one-room houses with frosted windows and damp floors, people gathered close. They shared food slowly, as if to make it last longer, and spoke of nothing more complicated than the hope that spring would not delay. The parents who lived through those winters understood that the holiday was not a miracle. It was a ritual, something repeated year after year to prove that humanity could make beauty even in hunger. A crust of bread split evenly among children, a single candle saved for weeks, a moment of laughter that briefly made the cold seem distant. Those gestures became the grammar of survival, the language that carried families through generations. When the industrial world expanded and poverty softened its grip, the memory of those gestures lingered. It was no longer needed for survival, but it was remembered for meaning. People still swept their floors before Christmas, still folded old linens neatly, still baked something simple that filled the house with warmth. They did it not because they had to, but because somewhere inside they knew that peace could not be purchased. It had to be built. Even now, in the brightness of modern life, that quiet discipline endures. Every time someone lowers their voice instead of raising it, every time they light a candle and watch it burn to the end, every time they choose to stay home rather than chase noise, they are keeping alive the same instinct that once held together families who had almost nothing but each other. There is a kind of inheritance that doesn't come through blood or wealth, but through memory. It moves quietly from one winter to the next, from one generation's sigh to another's silence. It teaches that rest is not idleness, that stillness is strength, and that even in a world flooded with light, there is wisdom in the dark. Imagine one of those poor houses again, the wooden boards creaking, the walls thin enough for the wind to whisper through. A mother sits near the fire, mending a sleeve with trembling hands. A father dozes beside her, his head bent forward, his boots cracked but warm. Children sleep in a row, breathing softly. The candle burns low. The room smells of smoke, wool and bread. Nothing about it is remarkable, yet everything about it is sacred. For a few hours, the noise of survival quiets, and the only sound is the steady rhythm of human life refusing to fade. That was Christmas then. And in truth, it is still Christmas now, beneath the glitter, beneath the songs, beneath the restless hum of modern comfort. Somewhere inside every celebration there remains that single ancient heartbeat, the will to gather, to share warmth, to last one more winter together. When you sit beside the fire tonight, or watch snow fall outside a dark window, you are part of that same story. The faces have changed, the rooms are brighter, but the purpose is the same. You are repeating what countless others once did, making light, however small, against the endless dark. And maybe that is why Christmas never truly ends. It circles back each year to remind us that love was born not out of plenty, but out of want, not from wealth, but from the refusal to give up when life was hardest. It is there every time a candle is lit for no reason, every time a hand rests gently on another, every time someone whispers goodnight into the quiet. The story of those quiet 1800s Christmases never really ended. It slipped into the bloodstream of winter itself, invisible but alive, hidden in the instincts of people who have never known hunger as their ancestors did, yet somehow still understand the value of a steady flame, a calm room, and the simple nearness of others when the wind begins to rise. Every December, the old rhythm returns without being called. People clean their homes, set aside small things, prepare food that feels familiar. They light candles for reasons they cannot quite explain. They move more carefully. They talk more softly. And though they may not think of it as remembrance, it is exactly that, a repetition of gestures that once meant survival, now performed as devotion. In those earlier centuries, poor families didn't believe in abundance. They believed in making use of everything. They saved ribbons, buttons, scraps of wax, small coins, even laughter. A song learned from a neighbor, a story told at the end of a day, the warmth of a fire borrowed from one house to another when coal ran out. It was through these exchanges that community was born, not from charity but from understanding that need itself could be shared. Modern comfort has changed what we fear, but not what we seek. The quiet nights that once belonged to the poor are now sought by everyone who feels the world move too fast. The same silence that once surrounded a single candle is now recreated in thousands of living rooms. Lights dimmed, voices lowered, the outside world briefly forgotten. And though we may think we are celebrating something new, we are really returning to the same ancient truth that peace is not given by circumstance, but chosen by will. There was a peculiar beauty in the way those poor families loved one another. Their affection had no ornaments. It was practical and solid, built on the knowledge that comfort was fleeting but care could last. A father walking miles through snow to bring home bread. A mother sewing late into the night so her children would have something clean to wear. A neighbor knocking at the door to share the last of her stew. These gestures were quiet, but they shaped the soul of Christmas far more deeply than gold or glitter ever could. The heart of that world beats still in the smallest things. A cup of tea made for someone tired, a window left open for the scent of pine, a blanket folded neatly over a sleeping child. They are not grand acts, but they hold the same weight. They are the proof that tenderness survived, that despite centuries of change, the old lesson of the poor still holds. Love cannot be stored, it must be used. And when snow begins to fall outside, softly, endlessly, the distance between centuries collapses. The poor mother in her dark room, the modern family around a glowing screen, the traveller staring at the night sky, all of them are joined by the same fragile wish. Let there be enough warmth, enough kindness, enough time. It is not a prayer for miracles, only for continuity, for the thread to hold. If you listen closely in those moments, the past begins to murmur. It speaks not in words, but in the quiet rhythm of ordinary things. The scrape of a chair across a wooden floor, the click of a latch, the sigh of the wind against the chimney. It says that Christmas was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be human, imperfect, fleeting, sincere. So the story continues, as softly as breath. Every year, when night falls early and the air smells faintly of smoke, the world turns back toward that same point of origin. A humble room, a small fire, a handful of people choosing to stay close until morning. It is a simple picture, but within it lies everything that has ever mattered. Warmth, presence, patience, love. And as long as those things survive, the old Christmas of the poor will never fade. It will live quietly behind the brightness of the modern world, reminding us that peace was never a luxury. It was a choice, and that even now, when the world rushes forward, there is still time to sit still, to breathe, to whisper, "We are here, we are together," and it is enough. Even now, when the world is faster and brighter than those narrow, smoky streets of the 19th century, the pulse of those quiet Christmases still beats beneath everything. It beats in the way people pause before turning on the lights, in the hush that falls over a room when the first snow begins to drift down, in the deep comfort that comes from nothing more complicated than the nearness of another person. For those who once lived poor in the 1800s, every December was both a promise and a test. The promise was that the days would eventually grow longer again. The test was surviving until they did. Christmas arrived like a small island in the frozen dark, a night when everyone agreed, silently, to stop fighting the cold for a little while, to sit still and listen to the sound of their own breathing, to remember what made life worth keeping. They owned almost nothing. Their walls leaked, their clothes were thin, their food was never enough. But when they gathered close, they built something invisible and indestructible, a sense of belonging that no storm could take away. The parents' eyes softened as they watched their children sleep. Neighbors knocked quietly to share the last spoon of soup or a scrap of wood for the fire, and in that closeness, the world felt less cruel. Poverty did not vanish, but for one night it was forgiven. As the century turned and generations passed, that forgiveness became a tradition all its own. Even families who no longer feared hunger kept the same habits: sweeping floors before supper, lighting a single candle, folding hands before eating, speaking in low voices, as if not to wake something fragile. The gestures had lost their necessity, but not their purpose. They were a way of remembering that peace was not an accident. It had to be made. Look closely, and you will see that we still make it. We make it when we slow our speech, when we lower a light instead of brightening it, when we listen more than we speak. Every act of gentleness in winter carries a faint echo of those older Christmases, when gentleness was the only luxury the poor could afford. And perhaps that is why even the most modern city grows quiet on Christmas Eve. It is not sentiment, it is inheritance. The same hush that once filled a single candlelit room now spreads across entire continents. Airplanes grow fewer in the sky, factories still their noise. Even the busiest streets seem to hold their breath. For a few hours, humanity remembers itself, remembers how to be still, how to be kind, how to be together. It is the oldest lesson the poor ever taught, the rich, and it is the one lesson the world never forgets for long. If you could stand outside on such a night, on any street in any country, you would feel it in the air. The cold, sharp, clear quiet, the faint smell of smoke, the light behind a curtain where someone reads or prays or simply sits awake watching the snow. It is the same scene that once played out in 100,000 cottages and tenements 2 centuries ago. The rooms have changed, but the feeling has not. Inside each of those rooms, whether now or then, someone is thinking the same small, defiant thought: we have enough for tonight. It is not wealth, it is not triumph, it is peace. The same peace that once settled over families who had nothing but the courage to face another morning, and who, without knowing it, built the foundation of every Christmas that would follow. And when the dawn finally comes, pale and blue and mercifully quiet, the world feels a little lighter. The poor of the past are gone, but the warmth they kindled has not gone out. It lives in every calm breath, every gentle word, every moment when people choose to sit close rather than drift apart. That was their gift to the centuries after them. Not decoration, not song, but silence, beautiful, necessary, enduring. So the story continues, as it always does. The year will turn again, and winter will come again, and someone somewhere will light a small flame against the dark. It will flicker, it will tremble, but it will not die, because the fire that once warmed the poor in the 1800s is the same one that warms us still. The quiet, human fire of compassion that makes the cold bearable and turns even the humblest night into something holy. There is something about winter that invites memory, not the sharp memory of detail or date, but the soft, dreamlike kind that lives beneath language, the memory of how it feels to be small before a great silence, how it feels to sit in the warmth while the wind moves past the walls outside. That is where the story of the poor at Christmas still lives. Not in history books, not in museums, but in that quiet instinct every person carries: the need to gather light when the days grow short, The people of the 1800s understood this in their bones. They were experts in the art of saving heat, saving bread, saving patience. When December came, they also learned to save something rarer, hope. They kept it hidden like a coal beneath ash, small but alive, and each Christmas they drew it out again to see if it would still burn. Most years it did. In a city street buried in snow, a woman once walked home from the factory with her shawl pulled tight, her breath turning white before her face. She carried a small loaf wrapped in paper, her only gift for the family waiting in the narrow room above a shop. They would eat it together, slowly, and afterward she would watch the children sleep by the embers, their faces calm for once. It was not happiness exactly, but it was peace, and in that peace she found something like holiness. Across the world, in a cabin near a frozen field, another family did the same. The father came in from the cold, his hands numb, his boots cracked. The mother stirred a pot of soup that smelled faintly of onions and herbs saved from summer. The children whispered stories they had learned from neighbors, stories that ended not with miracles but with survival. They spoke softly so that the fire would sound louder, so that the sound of warmth itself would fill the room. And in these thousands of small, forgotten scenes lay the true origin of Christmas as we know it. Not in wealth, not in spectacle, but in stillness. It was the quiet covenant people made with one another. I will share what little I have, and you will not be alone. Even now, when the world glitters with abundance, something in us longs for that simplicity. We turn off the lights, we watch the snow fall, we listen for the hush beneath the noise. And in that hush, the centuries blur together. The present becomes the past, and we are once again sitting beside the poor of the 1800s, feeling the same cold air and the same fragile warmth. There is no division in that moment. No rich, no poor, no before or after. Only human beings gathered around a small source of light, aware of how easily it could vanish, and therefore cherishing it all the more. That is why Christmas, for all its transformations, never loses its meaning. It does not belong to time. It belongs to the instinct that has kept us alive since the beginning, the need to create warmth where there is none. When the old people of that century grew frail, they spoke of Christmas not as a festival but as a pause in which life looked back on itself with mercy. They remembered the smell of coal smoke, the creak of frozen doors, the way light fell on the faces of sleeping children. They said it was in that silence that they understood the truth, that love was not loud, and survival was not a burden when it was shared. And so that understanding moved forward, one winter at a time, until it reached us. We may have forgotten their names, but we have not forgotten their lesson. Each time we lower our voices, each time we choose to be gentle when we could be busy, we are repeating their prayer. It asks for nothing grand, only this, that warmth continue, that kindness last, that no one be left alone in the dark. Outside, snow begins to fall again. It gathers on rooftops, on trees, on the quiet shoulders of statues that have seen 100 such winters. The world grows softer under its weight, as if learning again how to be gentle. Somewhere a candle flickers in a window, the same pale flame that burned in the hands of the poor more than a century ago. It wavers, but it holds. Inside, someone whispers goodnight. Another log settles in the fire. The room smells of wood and wool and sleep. It is nothing extraordinary, and yet it is everything the poor of the 1800s ever wanted. The sound of peace, the promise of morning, and as the hours slide quietly toward dawn, the old truth endures, that even when the world feels colder than it has ever been, a single light, shared faithfully, is enough to keep the darkness away. Somewhere far from the noise of the city, a single lamp glows in a window. The house it belongs to is small, perhaps only 2 rooms, but inside it is warm. Not warm in the way of luxury or excess, but in the way that feels human, created by hands and breath and care. A pot rests above a low flame, a chair creaks as someone shifts their weight. The clock ticks softly. It could be 2025 or 1825. Nothing in that moment belongs to time. That is the strange power of winter. It erases years. The same quiet that settled over poor families in the 1800s still settles now. The same comfort found in the company of others still returns, like a tide that no age can wash away. Perhaps that is why we light candles even in houses filled with electric light, because some part of us remembers when fire itself was life, when it meant another day survived, another meal shared, another chance to be kind. The poor of the 19th century had little, but they understood what mattered. They knew the sound of gratitude, the sigh that comes after a meal, the whispered thanks when the door closes against the wind. They understood that peace is not loud, it's a rhythm, a balance, a fragile agreement between the heart and the world outside. And though centuries have passed, that rhythm still guides us each December, even when we do not notice it. When people gather now, around tables heavy with food or beneath trees glittering with light, something ancient still stirs beneath all that brightness. It is the same quiet yearning that lived in the cold tenements of London and New York, in the stone cottages of Ireland, in the wooden cabins of the frontier. It whispers, "Be still, be gentle, remember what kept them warm," because warmth was never just heat. It was touch, laughter, patience, the sound of breathing together in the dark. It was trust, and when the poor of those years shared it, they created something that outlived them. Their Christmas was not an escape from struggle. It was a declaration of humanity inside it. Every candle lit, every crust of bread divided, every lullaby sung beside the fire was an act of defiance against despair. That defiance is the reason the holiday still carries meaning today. If you stand outside at night in December and listen, you can still hear it. The muffled hush of snow, the low hum of windows glowing from within, the sigh of the wind moving through empty streets. All of it sounds like the same song, the one the poor once knew by heart. It has no melody, only rhythm, the slow, steady beat of people surviving together. Inside, someone turns down the lamp. The last embers shift and settle. A child's breathing slows into sleep. The air smells of pine and smoke and rest. Outside, the cold presses close to the glass. But it cannot enter, not tonight, because there is warmth here, small but stubborn, and it has been passed down like a secret through the centuries. The poor of the 1800s may have vanished from memory, but their lessons remain in every quiet act of care, every door held open, every meal shared, every voice lowered so another can sleep. They taught the world that peace was not something you waited for. It was something you made, moment by moment, flame by flame. And that is why, even now, long after their fires have gone out, the warmth remains. It lives in us. It lives in the way we still reach for one another when the nights grow long. It lives in the stillness between words, in the soft glow of a single candle, in the comfort of knowing that across the world, in 1,000 rooms, the same small miracle is repeating. People choosing tenderness in a cold world. The snow continues to fall, covering roofs, chimneys, roads, and graves. But the light inside the houses never goes out. It glows through frost and history alike, reminding the living that someone once survived this darkness, and that we will too. And so the story keeps going, without end, without noise, carrying forward through every winter that has ever been, and every one still to come, the quiet, enduring faith that warmth made by human hands, tended by human hearts, is stronger than the cold. The world outside is pale now, covered in a light that feels neither day nor night, but something between, the kind of quiet light that belongs only to dawn in December. The snow has stopped falling, the wind has gone still, and the earth itself seems to be listening. Inside the house, the last candle burns low. Its flame trembles as if uncertain whether to stay or go, and in that hesitation lies the whole meaning of Christmas, the fragile beauty of light choosing to remain, even when the darkness still surrounds it. The poor of the 1800s would have known this moment. They would have sat exactly as we sit now, tired but calm, watching the faint line of morning begin to lift against the cold horizon. Their rooms were small, their fires weak, but their eyes reflected that same quiet understanding, that life, though harsh, had endured once more, that love had survived another night. And maybe that is all Christmas was ever meant to be. Not a spectacle, not a promise of perfection, but a pause, a reminder that existence itself is a kind of miracle. Every breath drawn against the cold, every gesture of care given without being asked for, every humble flame lit in the dark, all of it part of the same ancient vow. We will keep each other warm. Centuries have passed since those nights of thin soup and thick blankets, of families gathered around small fires, whispering stories while the snow whispered back at their windows. The faces are gone, the walls replaced, the world unrecognizable, but their warmth remains. It has become our instinct to draw closer in the cold, to make light when the dark returns, to give even when we are unsure we have enough. That instinct is their legacy, their immortality. And now, as the first light of morning spills through the frost-glazed glass, the story closes the way it began, quietly, gently, with the sound of human breath and the soft crackle of a dying fire. The candle's flame bends once more, then steadies. Somewhere far away, a church bell rings. A bird stirs in the snow. The world turns. The poor of the 1800s are gone, but the echo of their Christmas remains, not in history books, not in carols or celebrations, but in the way people still choose tenderness, still choose to share, still choose to believe that warmth, once kindled, should never be lost. So when the next winter comes and the next after that, remember them. Remember the small rooms and the quiet hands that built the first true meaning of Christmas. That love is not found in what we have, but in what we keep alive together. And as the fire finally fades, the last ember glows like a heartbeat. The room falls silent. The world outside brightens. The night ends, not with triumph, but with peace. And somewhere, in that peace, the story whispers its final truth, that no one, in any century, ever faces the cold alone.